just knowing what I know. Knowing her.
Oh, great. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. And we are getting started. What I'm going to do is, if I could, I'm going to ask folks to introduce themselves, and I'll try and put my glasses on and see if we can start on the right side. That way we'll also test your mics.
Jermaine Hardy, probation.
Sarah Cody, Public Health. Tony Telly's Behavioral Health.
Very, very broken.
I was going to say, you got the gag one. I'm so sorry, Tony.
Molly O'Neill, Public Defender.
Bob Minicucci, Social Services.
Casey Halkin, Victim Services DA's Office.
Mary Crocker Cook, Behavioral Health Board.
Eddie Garcia, San Jose Police Chief.
Matthew Fisk, Pretrial Services.
Keeley, Supportive Housing.
Gary Hersig, Deputy County Execs, and then for Miguel Marquez.
Cindy Chavez, member of the Board of Supervisors.
Stephen Manley, Superior Court.
Deborah Ryan, Presiding Judge, Superior Court.
Steve Olmos, I'm alternate for Dr. Mary Ann Dewan, Superintendent, Santa Clara County Office of Education.
Erin O'Brien, Community Solutions. Kwasiwat Trinidad Connection, sitting in for Rose Amador.
Juliana Ibrahim, sitting in for Kishan Bujini from the Consortium of Adult Education.
Pablo, perfect timing.
Pablo Gaxiola, former consumer.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to public comment, and then we'll go to the consent calendar. And I just want to talk a little bit about the construct of the meeting today. And we're going to invite up Scott Largent to speak. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Right when you are, Dave. Thank you, everybody. Scott Largent. This yesterday at the San Jose City Council meeting, we were discussing Laura's Law. It was good to chime in with everybody else that was there, but when you listen to the council talk about anything involving behavioral health, I pull hair out because I do attend all these other meetings, so I kind of get what's going on, and I've never been in front of a group that just doesn't get it. But then when the county starts talking about everything that the city's doing, it's the same thing. They're out to lunch also too. I don't know why we're all kind of in this together. Most of you politicians were with the city prior before the county. Why can't you just communicate with each other? It seems very simple. Okay, this little flyer that we hand out from Behavioral Health doesn't work. These people don't show up downtown. When I film severely mentally ill people, which are mostly 90% of them are meth addicts, they don't show up when you call this number. I continue to call this number. Most of the people on the council don't even realize that the public can call this number now, because none of this works. It's an absolute failure. When I leave my appointments downtown, because that's most of the reason why I'm down there, I have drug classes, I have stuff involving the courts, I have therapy down the street, I have mental health services. It's all up and down the light rail and Santa Clara Street, okay? I kind of have to be down there. But when I leave my visit to see my daughter at the courthouse, I've got to go sit, I got to decide, am I going to wait for the light rail and smell the methamphetamines and watch people defecating in the park and fighting? Am I going to watch that? Or am I going to try to walk to the next light rail thing and damn near get attacked? I have to make these decisions up because you people aren't making it safe for recovering addicts to be downtown. It is not safe down there. And the businesses, they're jumping ship, and they're jumping ship fast. These are tech companies that sign big leases down there. And I was a business owner in the past, and when I had my family showing up to visit me at my office, you know, even my coworkers, even employees that I got to know over time, I wanted them protected. I wanted them safe. If I owned a business, I wouldn't get near San Jose. I would say, get out of here. Go to Austin, Texas, where it's a little safer. Why is nobody paying attention to this? And where is behavioral health? You guys should set up shop downtown right near St. James Park. There's buildings for lease right there. County's got tons of money. And I would appreciate, Chief Garcia, maybe you should start coming into public comment and start chewing all these people out, because they're making your officers' lives very, very difficult because this money's not going in the right direction. And they're fed up with it. They don't want to be babysitters. They want to be police officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. With that, we're going to go to our consent calendar, and this is to put item 10, our Reentry Resource Center Quarterly Report Dashboard, and item 11, our updates regarding the Reentry Resource Center clients and services. Item 12 is our meeting schedule, and then 13, 14, and 15 are past minutes. Is there anybody who would like to take anything off consent? Is there anybody who would like to add anything to consent? Seeing none, may I get a motion for the consent calendar? We have a motion. May I have a second? A second from Aaron. And then, Scott, you have on yours, the second thing you wanted to speak on, I'm not sure what item it is. If it's an item, was it 11 that's on consent? Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. I try not to talk too much. This is the therapy I had to go with because the county couldn't provide me any type of services. Now, remember, I'm coming 4 years up on being clean. How many times have I asked for drug treatment? You know, I go to the free stuff, but there's not very many things out there for meth addicts. There's AA, NA, you know, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Right here on the consent calendar, we have statistics that we're talking about, because I remember when the reentry people get in here and they put all these, you know, graphs up here and show all these great things that were going on. Okay, this committee here dug a trench in the wrong direction for 3 years chasing booze and opioids when they're all meth addicts. So have we successfully retooled that thing over there right now to be able to detox meth addicts? I know I talked about it for 3 years, but is that done now? Because I really don't know if it is. We had a bunch of empty recliners sitting over there. We had the ability to fill that place. Do we admit our mistakes? Nobody was paying attention at all, and that place is a war zone downtown. The PD, half the officers don't even understand what that thing is over there. Then they understand it's a failure and it more likely isn't going to work anyway. I am stuck down here. I have to go to all this stuff, and I just don't understand. We got a lot of intelligent people in a room right here that really are not listening. They're not listening at all. And I feel so bad that I want to cancel my visits now at the courthouse right now. My ex has to feed that meter across from St. James Park right there. There's poop all over the thing. There's somebody screaming at her as she's trying to hold my child's hand to get her into a visit. Why can't we protect people right out there? The worst of the worst that are in that park, up and down the light rail, start taking care of it. Because the other homeless people farther down, they're elderly women. They're nice people. There's people that lost their homes. The worst of the worst is down there, and these are bad people, and nobody's doing anything about it. I've been attacked down there damn near 5 or 10. It's bad. It really is bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on that motion? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt. You do have a duplicate item on here that needs to be deleted.
Was that item 11?
Item 11 is
Okay.
correct.
Yeah, then we'll remove that as well.
Thank you.
All right, so we have, anybody want to change their vote? All right, that passed unanimously. Thanks very much for catching that. So item 4, this is to receive a report from the Social Services Agency, Department of Aging and Adult Services relating to the inclusion of LPS conservatorship in the county's jail diversion program. And if the folks who are presenting, I think this is Mary Ann. And maybe, may we help her? So you can sit here at this area, this countership. Maya's going to show you. Yeah, please.
And let me actually, since we did a LPS presentation some time ago, and we have a staff presentation that will be made now by Mary Ann Warren. But I wanted to welcome Mary Ann. She's newer to the county. I think you've been here for a few months now, but she joins us from San Francisco. And I think that's going to be very helpful as we think through this issue with the experience that Mary Ann has in San Francisco, and she can maybe talk a little bit about that, or we can ask some questions. So with that, turn it. And there's a button underneath your microphone.
Is that better?
Yes.
So how do you do? I'm Mary Ann Warren. I'm the Chief Public Guardian here in Santa Clara County, and I was in the same position in San Francisco County for 14 years before I came here in February. Part of the presentation at the end does include some of the material from San Francisco. So I believe this has been presented before about the essentials of the LPS conservatorship and the criteria and how we're working with jail diversion to keep some people from recidivism and keeping mentally ill clients inappropriately locked in jail. So can I have the next slide, or can I control it from? Oh. Thank you. In brief, the conservatorship laws started from 3 Assemblymen, Landerman, Petrie, and Short, who redesigned the laws in California for mentally ill clients in the late 60s. They found that clients were being held unreasonably long and without any due process, so they instituted the California Welfare and Institutions Code, the 5000 section. So the bill, LPS conservatorship, is also known as mental health conservatorship, and it's for those people who are gravely disabled, which means unable to take care of themselves by finding food, clothing, and shelter due to a severe mental illness. When the public conservator is appointed, well, actually when any conservator is appointed, that conservator is charged with putting the conservatee in the least restrictive environment that is appropriate to the needs of them, the individual, and the most protective of the individual's choice, rights to dignity, freedom, and choice. Having said that, it also is impacted sometimes by the client's ability to pay for services and placements. So we've been working with the jail, and last year we only had, in fiscal year 18-19, we had 31 referrals from jail for conservatees. And of those, we filed on 29 for conservatorships. 2 were not filed because they were out-of-county residents, and the law dictates that you have to be a Santa Clara County resident to be conserved here. Of those, 22 were temporarily conserved and 7 were on permanent conservatorship. And of those, 5 are still in jail. I'm sorry, I can't see. 1 went to a homeless shelter, some went home to family. We got a few into residential treatment programs because, as Scott pointed out, many of these clients do have addiction issues. Some were released and we don't know where they went, and then we had some short-term housing. 2 went to institutes for mental diseases, locked psychiatric facilities. 4 are still in jail, and 1 went to Napa State Hospital. This hasn't been presented with the jail reentry earlier, but I wanted to point out that we also have LPS clients who are on what's called Murphy conservatorships, which are a little bit different than the traditional conservatorship. But these are people who are charged with felonies involving death, great bodily harm, or a serious threat to the physical well-being of another person. That person is unable to understand the charges against them and are not able to participate in their defense. So they're incompetent to stand trial, they have a mental illness, and they have a serious charge pending, and they're dangerous. So they are referred on a Murphy conservatorship. We have a lot more of these than we used to. From 1989 to 2014, there were only 11 referral for Murphy conservatorships. Since 2015, we've had 24, and we currently have 25 conservatees on a Murphy conservatorship. So these are people who would be in jail if they were able to participate in their defense and lost their trial, but they are just unable to participate in the defense, and it's unreasonable to keep them in jail, so they're appropriately placed generally in locked psychiatric facilities. So this gives you an indication of, from 1989 to 2014, how many referrals we've had and how many we've had since then. So of the Murphy conservatorships, 10 have been released from Murphy conservatorships and discharged to the community. They were released after being found no longer gravely disabled and after an evidentiary hearing. 2 conservatees unfortunately died while under the Murphy conservatorship. We've had 4 jury trials since 1989, 3 this year, and 2 lost their trials and were placed on their Murphy conservatorship. 2 actually won their trial and was released, and the other won the Murphy conservatorship, but then was subsequently reappointed on a traditional LPS conservatorship and was placed in a locked facility. So one of the newest things that we've done, going back to the traditional jail diversion program, is we have been able to do a little bit more data sharing with our partners. The public conservator uses a database program called Panoramic, and we've been able to give read-only access to our partners. And they just get basic information: conservatee's name, address, social security number, date of birth, and it also includes the phone number and name of the current conservatee. So we have 13 registered partners who are using it in EPS, mobile crisis, mental health, and behavioral health. So if they get an after-hours client or call, they can check and see if somebody is in fact conserved and the history of their conservatorship. It's only went into effect since July, so we don't have a lot of data, but we do know the number of our after-hours calls has decreased dramatically. So by doing this, we can identify shared clients. Staff members are able to identify each other more quickly and communicate more quickly to provide better services. And again, we don't know the data yet, but we are tracking it. We continue to do trainings with our partners. We've done trainings this year with adult and older adult divisions of behavioral health. We're also working with behavioral health to have UCSF identify or reassess our Murphy conservatees to identify if they are in fact still a danger to others and if it is appropriate to be keeping them held if they are no longer gravely disabled or alternatively are now able to participate in their own defense. And we continue to attend reentry network meetings to help in the discussion with our LPS clients. Some of the statewide trends is there's an increase in homeless and mentally ill. There's a lot of concern for the increase in homeless and mentally ill, and the number of beds and places to put people is decreasing, and it's hard to find appropriate placement. In July this year, a handful of assemblymen wrote the governor's office to start an audit of LPS conservatorship across the state, which will impact all of this. Each county does things just a little bit differently, and each county has conservatorship in different setups. Here it's in aging and adult services. In other counties it's in mental health. So the audit is being done of 3 counties, large, medium, and small. I think it's San Francisco, LA, and Humboldt, but I'm not certain. But the goal is to find out if the laws are written appropriately, how do we change them, and how do we impact the clients who need it the most. The findings should be out within a year or so. So I did come from San Francisco, and one of the things we piloted there was the Community Independence Participation Program and the post-acute community conservatorships. And the goal of both of these programs was to have people go from psych emergency services into an appropriate setting rather than directly to a locked psych facility, but to give them community-based support. The Community Independence Participation Program started with people who had support already in the services in terms of finding a place to live. They had family, and they would agree to voluntarily be conserved if they could go home to family, be in a supportive setting, and they had to agree to be on long-acting psychotropic medications, usually a once-a-month shot, and they had to go to the courts once a month with a huge support group. They have intensive case managers, the DA, the public conservator. The DA is no longer representing the public conservator. Now it's the city attorney's office, but at the time it was the DA. And the public defender would all come and support these people. Then the post-acute community grew out of it, where it was people who were a little less willing to voluntarily succumb to a conservatorship and agree to take their meds. These are people who are less willing to do long-term injectables, but do so that they can avoid being put in a long-term psych facility. So, and again, they must have adequate housing, and the support networks are set in place before they are released from the hospital. They have housing. They all have given up their right to refuse psychotropic medication. They meet with the judge on a regular basis, and there is much in terms of positive support and positive reinforcement when going to the judge. They get taxi vouchers, Safeway vouchers, and just a lot of positive reinforcement. And it's been very successful, so successful that Alameda is starting to initiate a similar program. And this is just more detail about it. Again, going to court, conserved, but on somewhat a voluntary basis. Then San Francisco is also implementing a pilot program with SB 1045, which was a bill written by Scott Wiener in San Francisco. And this is a way to forego the traditional 5150 route to conservatorship. And ordinarily, somebody who's conserved starts on a 3-day 5150 hold, and then a 5250 14-day hold, and then if conserved, generally going to a locked psych facility. So what we've discovered is how many people were being held on 5150s and not referred for conservatorship and released to the community, and sort of a revolving door where they would go in, get some treatment, go back out, and return. So the goal of this new bill is to treat these people appropriately and not have them go to locked psych facilities, and can in fact be conserved from the community. The goal is to get people who have had 8 5150s in a 12-month period, who have a coexisting homelessness, serious mental illness, and drug or alcohol substance abuse problem. So, and before they can be conserved, they're referred to AOT, the Laura's Law group, to see if that might be a lesser restrictive alternative. This has just started, so there's no data as yet. Referrals come from mental health. They can come from the sheriff, who does the 5150s, and they refer to the public conservator, who then in turn reaches out to AOT. If AOT is unwilling or unable to help this person, then the goal is to have them conserved, and the county will be responsible for finding appropriate placement with supportive services, wraparound services, and again, intensive case management. But this is just going into effect in January, so we have to wait to see how it turns out. And that's it. Do you have any questions?
I'm sure there will be lots. I can see people leaning in. What I'd like to do is, we have one public speaker, and I normally like to hear from the public before I let us go, so that we can have perspective. And Scott would like to speak on this item. And then if folks would like to speak, if they can turn their lights on, I'll call on you as I see them lit up. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I've been doing a little more research on the Laura's Law gig and understanding more about conservatorship. So I do apologize if I'm not really up to speed on it. I did a short stint at the Don Lowe Pavilion there. I spent about 7 hours in there. It was about 3 or 4 weeks of coming off of methamphetamine, so I was still all over the place. They didn't hold me there. When you talk about the voluntary holds for people, in my situation, if there was the ability to sign on the dotted line and go somewhere and get some real help and pull me out of the environment I was in, I was throwing in the towel. I was done with it. I did kind of have family support at that point before everything really, really went downhill. Why aren't we pulling people out of this environment? I understand once you've been sober long enough to go to all your appointments and stuff here, why are we not doing that? Why are we not sending people out of state? Why are we not sending them to, why don't we sign a contract with that camp rehab that's up off of Highway 17 up there and start sending people up there that are really committed to remaining sober and kind of getting out of this stuff. I don't think they can do it downtown. I don't think they can do it around there getting off of methamphetamines. I really don't think so. And we don't have adequate services right now. And that Don Lowe Pavilion, when I film the people that are being arrested by your officers, Eddie, that are being brought in there because they're so frustrated, I go over there and I just kind of camp out. 5 or 6 hours later, the same person is being released. Somebody that was butt naked, running their head into walls and causing all these problems. How are they released right away? And how are we not figuring out a way to maybe keep them there for a week? You know, maybe offer them a free dinner and a place to stay for a week, to stay off of meth for a week, or get them out of that environment. They're right back out there doing the same thing, and the officers are like, what are we going to do? It's frustrating, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to start with Chief Garcia.
Yeah, just a question. Is there any mechanism by which first responders can make direct referrals? Whether it's law enforcement or with the assistance we're getting from behavioral health with mobile mental health, if they can make referrals from the field?
For a conservatorship?
Yes.
No, as it is right now, the person needs to be held on a 5150, and then the referral comes from the hospital.
Okay.
Thank you. Just with respect to the SB 1045 pilot program, I thought we should just be clear, as I understand it, so please confirm my understanding or correct it. It's a pilot program, not in the sense that every county that wants to do it as a pilot is authorized to do it, but rather it's a pilot that I think 3 or 4 counties were specifically authorized. Is that correct?
It was originally San Francisco, Orange, and LA counties, and Orange and LA have opted out. So it's just San Francisco now.
But other counties are just not, under state law, authorized to do even that program, as limited as it was. As you said, I think you said 8 5150s in a 12-month period,
right,
plus a whole bunch of other criteria. So I really make that point, partly so when people think through this, we're just not authorized in this county under law to implement that program. And we should look at it and see what we learned from San Francisco, but we're not authorized to do it ourselves. And to say that that's the one tweak in the law that's happened since we last spoke about this issue, but otherwise it is still a very restrictive system and one that requires, as you said, from the hospital, but it's a medical diagnosis from a physician that, of grave disability that's required to initiate and to go forward with a LPS conservatorship. Is that correct?
Right.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to make those clarifying points.
I'm going to go to Erin, and then may I come to you, Tony? Go ahead, Erin. Only because it might help. She might be able to answer your question is what I'm thinking.
Just a couple questions to kind of get the context. So it was 31 referrals out of jail for the last year for conservatorships. How many were total for the county?
That was the county.
Oh,
I'm
no,
sorry.
No,
you
no.
mean total conservatorships?
Correct. Yeah.
Referrals, we had over 400 last year.
Okay. And on the Murphy conservatorships, you said they've gone up. Have they gone up as a percentage or stayed static as a percentage of all of the LPS conservatorships?
It's they've gone up.
So more violent
But,
people
yeah.
needing to be conserved. Okay. Thanks.
Tony? Let's not give her the broken one again, the one that's not plugged in.
So a couple of things. Thank you, Marianne. Marianne and I know what's going on this. I think the other thing that's really important is, in addition to looking at LA, San Francisco, and Humboldt, there's also conversation about the LPS legislation itself. So I was on a meeting, on a call this last week with our director statewide, and we had information from all of the statewide public guardians talking about the current legislation that's been around for a very long time, and is there opportunity to relook at that legislation. So we had our first call as the directors this week, and I know that the State Association for all the Public Guardians also met, because you've identified and provided us with what your recommendations are. So I think, in addition to looking at the processes in the 3 counties that have been identified, there's also quite a conversation that's beginning on, is the law as it stands, Should it remain as is, or should there be changes? And it's very early in this, but we are having those, we just started those conversations.
So
Can I just chime in on that just quickly?
Oh, sorry. Like, where did that voice come from? Go ahead.
So one of the things that was implemented, and this doesn't have to do necessarily with reentry, but in San Francisco, we've also implemented the 5270 hold, which, so somebody comes in on a 5150 hold into psych emergency services, and they can be held for 3 days. Should they need subsequent treatment, they're held on a 5250 for an additional 14 days. The 5270 was implemented 4 years ago, and it provides for an additional 30 days treatments prior to conservatorship. And that's brought the number of conservatorships down dramatically in San Francisco, as the majority were held for under 45 days.
That's very helpful. You know, Molly, go ahead.
Thank you. I have about 300 questions, but I'm just going to ask two. You said that 31 referrals came from the jail and 29 of them were conserved. And then you answered Aaron's question about how many total were there, and that was 400. How many of those were conserved of those 400 referrals?
I don't know exactly, but we go through, and everybody who meets criteria is conserved, and really the only thing that is excluding people right now from meeting criteria is out-of-county resident, or if they are deemed no longer gravely disabled before we finish our investigation. But probably 95% were conserved.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was related to the pilot program in San Francisco. You said Orange and LA opted out, and I was wondering why, if you know, that happened, and also what kind of financial
that answers its
how
own
much,
question.
How much
there is no
because
finance.
it was too expensive?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was originally called a housing conservatorship, which was a misnomer, as it comes with no funding for housing.
So how much money did San Francisco put into the program?
I don't know. I left in February, and the numbers have changed
Thank you.
dramatically.
Eddie?
Just one last question. So from a first responder, again, boots on the ground, that's dealing with an issue, and, you know, we take someone under 5150 as an example that's been a recurrent 5150. Obviously, we know, you know, we talk about the 3 days, but we know there's a large percentage that aren't held 72 hours, that they're released fairly quickly. So what, I guess advice maybe might be the wrong word, but what can we do from a first responder perspective that can assist that referral process once they get to 5150?
Tony, can I defer to you on that one?
So we have launched the outreach teams that are county operated. You and I think are having a meeting on this week, that are county operated, who are going to be working with anybody coming out of EPS, anybody. So these teams will have their names, have their information, we'll be following them up and really trying to get them connected to services. We're aware of we're very much aware of the 5150s, and we appreciate that you are sending people to EPS, and then when your officers call or my mobile crisis team calls and said they've been released, I know that that's very difficult for law enforcement. I think what might be helpful, and I would offer this to Miguel and to Supervisor Chavez, is perhaps having a segment about EPS and the work that is underway right now at EPS with Paul Lorenz.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good idea. Let me also just make an observation that, so on the 17th, you all are coming back, with a response to some recommendations that, in fact, that I got feedback from a number of people on the dais to bring forward to the board so that we can take a deeper dive into the best way to respond. I think in our community, one of the challenges has been that we have a not unlike San Francisco, a lot of moving parts. Unlike San Francisco, because we're not a city and a county, the knitting together that's required to really make some of these more complicated programs work is very, very challenging. So I think that's kind of problem number one. I think problem number two is that, you know, for example, your placement here in SSA actually led to some really great outcomes for seniors, but it meant that there was a whole part of the conservatorship program that we didn't and haven't been able to really offer the folks who are really in high need, like some of our homeless, really significantly mentally ill folks. And I think it's because we, and not in a bad way, but we designed a program to serve a very particular population. And I'm sure you're seeing some of that as you're coming in, that we're a little bit limited. So one of the opportunities, I think, is to figure out a way to connect your role more to mental health, and obviously in partnership with SSA, but to really take a deeper dive with this really high need population. And second, to look at staffing to address that. And then third is that we have this really interesting, I think, opportunity, and that is that because so many people that we see are really funneled through through an emergency response through 5150, that one of the opportunities we have is in the decision making that happens in that infrastructure. Because one of the challenges, I think, actually that Scott raised, but I've heard the folks who work at within our emergency psych services, they're seeing people coming back because quickly because the step we're taking to make a determination about where they should go isn't working. Like, that mechanism's not working. Otherwise, we wouldn't see people cycling back through. And then let me just add one other thing that I'm hoping the December 17th referral, the response to mine and Dave's referral comes back, is that we take an honest look at the areas where we have high need. And I think one of the points that, Marianne, that you raised that I think is just right on is that a lot of program rests on whether or not we have people having housing. So one of the interesting things to me about Laura's Law is it's outpatient, which means that, and I've had this conversation with a couple of your council members, because the concern I've had about using that, even that mechanism, is that outpatient treatment works if the person has a place to be in between the outpatient treatment, which means essentially we're talking about housed people that should have access to, and I think there's a case to be made for some access to that kind of strategy for Laura's Law. But the bigger question in my mind is, under what terms and conditions do we deem it appropriate societally, and I mean this in a very broad way, that we put people in locked facilities and create conditions that people do take their medication? And that is a much deeper discussion, and it also requires us to take a look at the number of locked beds. So, for example, one of the things I was explaining to one of your council members the other day is that they were saying we have zero locked beds in the county, and that's actually not true. We have 151 locked beds that I know of that we directly have some mechanism for placing people into, or we fund. I think the question there is, do we have people there who are supposed to be there? I think that's a very fair question about whether or not we should keep people restrained. And then the second question is, how many more do we need to add? Like, what's that need? And let's take a look at how we do that. But then the other is, there's something in between a locked facility and a hard to get out of facility. And that's something, actually, a concept that actually, Aaron, I don't think it might have been you, but I was having a conversation with some of our mental health providers who were talking about, creating facilities that are least restrictive because they're in between. You can't just run out the front door, and they're not easy to leave. And we're looking at something similar for victims of human trafficking and a couple of other areas where the risk of them getting abused by someone is so high, but they haven't committed a crime enough for us to lock them away. But how do we get them to take services? So, in all likelihood, you were not included in the response we're going to get on December 17th.
No, she was, Supervisor. And
you
she'll be
were?
with us on
Oh,
the
great! Because I was like, who is that? Why is she here? I'm so excited. So, good. Because what I'm gonna ask is that the last two issues that I raised are, because I think this is really kind of the critical one, is that mechanism for placement is going to be critical. And then what's the opportunity for us to determine what is the locked bed need in our county? Like what concretely is that need? And in terms of numbers, because we can't plan if we don't know. And I think we don't know because we're not really assertively trying to support people who are on the street and out of their mind, absent them ending up in our shelter. Because they can't sign up for VDAT, SPDAT, there's just a million things they can't do. They don't have the capacity to do it. So, and then one other thing I'll just mention, just for you all to think about too, is that through behavioral health, they are adding more detox beds. And this is actually kind of important because Scott raised an interesting point about, in particular about meth. And one thing you might want to mention when you give the presentation is how many detox beds we're adding and what the next step in that is. And so, for example, Pathway is going to include, I don't know if they have 2 or 4 detox beds that they're going to, but the next question for us is whether or not we should be looking at St. Louis or O'Connor for medical detox that is of a higher level. So the detox beds that we're going to be providing are for live-in. So we'd be taking someone off the street, they'd be detoxing in a facility where there's medical professionals. One of the challenges that we have, especially with meth, is that people who are on meth are on a lot of things. And so detoxing them in a regular environment may literally not be safe. And so one of the things I want to take a look at is whether or not we need to add medical detox. It may make more sense to do it at VMC because of the other facilities we have there, but the place I know we have room is St. Louis and O'Connor.
And we
So-
have had those conversations, and you'll hear about that in our presentation.
Oh, excellent. Good, good, good. So you might want to come. We'll figure that out. It's Tuesday. You got time. You got nothing going on Tuesdays. All right. Anybody else? Oh, Maya and then Judge Manley. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to echo a point about the referrals. I represent District 7, probably one of the most impacted areas in the city of San Jose, along with the downtown area. And there are some individuals that I know I have had to personally pull over and call 911 for. And after a few incidents, I was able to go out on a ride-along to EPS. And I met an individual who he told me he had been in there earlier that same day. And these are some of the revolving door issues that are a concern, as well as the need to make a more direct referral. I can think of a gentleman in Santee where the city, between the mobile crisis unit and other folks, went out 11 times. And then fortunately, thank you to behavioral health, we were able to get that individual some help. But I think what we're feeling at the city and with our first responders is the need to make a more direct referral so that process can that assessment and process can move through. So I just wanted to echo that point.
I think we'll make sure that question gets answered, but I think the law, and maybe we'll just be ready to answer that question from a legal perspective as to whether or not, what's allowed or not. And I don't know the answer to that. I will say I'm not pleased with the mechanism we're using now because I think not only do I think it's constrained, but I think we have to make those decisions about need separate of the decisions about cost and availability, because otherwise we're not intellectually honest in terms of how we're counting what we should be planning for. And I think that's actually part of the challenge we have as well. Erin, did you want to make a comment? And then Judge Manley.
I just wanted to say, and I've said it before, that I cannot overstate the importance of engagement when you're working with these folks in terms of having the time to build that relationship and build that trust. And housing is treatment. We cannot be expecting people to get clean on the street, and to take them from the street to locked, I think is highly problematic to take away their rights. We have to be offering them in between.
I think the question, Erin, is that one, I think you're totally right. I agree with you 100%. I also think that, and I'll go back to the point I was raising with Marianne, is that I think we weren't thinking about all of our options. And so because of that, I don't think we've trained people on that kind of approach or engagement. And I think that's got to be a big part of the discussion. I mean, if you're let me just say this, not one of our nonprofits, none of them are able, it has been my observation, to address enough the high need folks relative to engagement in a way that, like, I think we have a handful of people who have that skill. I do not think it's across our system.
I will say that I think we can always build skill further, but I think that what ends up happening, and Tony's got teams now that are going to be doing broad engagement, but a lot of the CBOs, it's like, go engage that person. So that's kind of a different thing in terms of saying, you know, here's a whole park full of people in need. I'm going to see who's willing to come in versus that person's moved to the top of the list, and that's the one we want to engage and get moved in. And I do think that we have, you know, we have county people who are skilled at that. We've got CBO people who are skilled at that. But I think that we've not invested, as far as I'm concerned, in the engagement the way that we need to.
Right, and I would just offer, I think, also in the housing, because I think, yeah, I think
And-
they're
and-
both, they've got to be connected.
And I will say, and I am really proud of what everybody's doing in Santa Clara County in terms of housing, but it isn't an immediate kind of thing. And so it's challenging.
Yeah, we do have to build it. All right, Judge Manley, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. Oh, can I borrow it? Well, then you can't stop me, you know, really, to hit me. I just had a couple, well, one point I wanted to make regarding the lock facilities. It's in talking with the state, our waiver, they intend to request the waiver for IMD, which they do not have now. We have a waiver, you know, for Medicaid, Medi-Cal dollars for residential, for substance abuse, but not for mental health. So I think that will be of some help to us. But what I really wanted to ask you is, you gave those numbers initially about how many, I think it was 30-something from the jail. In San Francisco, how many referrals would you receive yearly from the jail?
I don't know offhand, but I could find out and report back on the 17th if that would help.
Do you think it's larger or smaller or about the same?
I think it's about the same.
Okay. Wow. My second...
Actually, I'm going to change that answer. I think it's smaller.
Smaller. Yeah. Okay. The second area I wanted to ask you about was the audit, because I'm very familiar with that. And I work with a group of judges across the state, not my county, but across the state, who hear these cases and are very interested in doing the right thing. And the issue I think that may well be addressed, I know the legislature every year is trying to address it, and in this pilot, it's being addressed somewhat, is the definition of grave disability. It seems to me that across the state, depending on which county you're in, which hospital, the definitions are all different, and there are medical decisions being made, and I understand that. And have you done any work or research or thought about that definition and whether it should change? And if so, do you have a recommendation?
I don't have a specific answer, and I do think that's one of the goals of the audit, but I would even say that it doesn't change from county to county. I think there are changes within the county based upon the doctor you're seeing at
Right.
a given time.
I'm sorry, I misspoke about that. But I think it depends on the doctor and it depends on the county. And again, to me, it always depends on money. And then we go back to housing and the rest. So that's all I wanted to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pablo?
So I just wanted to get back to, and I have a quick question maybe somebody could answer. When we're talking about individuals that are going through psychosis and they're going through meth-induced, issues, they're completely losing it. So I work with a community-based organization where we do employment. We develop the level of trust with individuals where we give them instructions, like if you're struggling, reach out to somebody. If you need help, reach out to somebody. But time and time again, we get these individuals that maybe miss work once or twice, and then they'll show up on the third day and they're just completely gone. They're gone. And they're like, I need help. I need to get into treatment. That's the moment where they're doing what we've instilled in them. We've done a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy. We've done some MRT, and they're rethinking the process that they normally go to. And so some of the stuff that we're doing along that continuum is working, but it's that part where individuals make that decision, and that's what we can't buy. Like, we can't give nobody, or we can't put that in a bottle and give it. That comes as a personal. That's the magic one. When individuals finally get to that point where they're, you know what, I need help. For me,
Absolutely.
I've had it happen, and then I don't know where to send them. I don't know what to do. I say, okay, let's get on the phone and let's call Gateway. But if it happens at 4:45, 5 o'clock, and we'll stay late, but that individual still has to leave, get clean, or figure out a way to pass a drug screening, or what are we doing in our current system? Like, what do I tell these folks?
Tony, could you grab a not broken mic? Thank you.
Hello. Bruce Copley we have a whole panel that'll be here next week, and he'll be talking about the whole thing with meth. Meth has been the #1 substance use issue in this county for many, many years. About 49% of the substance use issues have been related to meth. There is no medication treatment for meth, so you have to go through therapy and you have to be willing to do it. What we believe we need in the county is a medical detox, because having a temporary detox in an outpatient setting does not provide these individuals with a length of stay and enough support to really get clean and get the services that they need. So that's been a conversation that we've had outside with the CEO of the medical center. But meth has been the drug here and in most of the Bay Area counties, much more than the opiates that everybody hears about in other parts of the country. Meth is the drug of choice in the Bay Area.
Yeah,
It
I
has
think
been for
that
a very long time.
it's apparent the opioid addiction. There's the epidemic has the most drastic resorts where people are dying in it, and it's more like prevalent. But people are on meth, and they've been on meth for years. And they're slowly and gradually declining. Where even when folks do get better, they still have the traits that have been left behind because they've been doing those same behaviors for such a long time. I just think that we need to figure out a way for when people get to that point where they're following the instructions that they get from the places that they're going to get help. Reach out to us when you need help, and then they reach out, and we're still
can't
kind of
respond.
struggling without helping them.
Tony, maybe for the meeting on Tuesday, if we could be ready to respond to that particular
I'll just add
question,
that,
and
yeah.
and I think there may be a today answer and an aspirational answer, and I think those are okay. I just think we need to be crystal clear about where we are on that. I see Eddie, and then I'll go back to Maya, and then to Judge Manley. I know you judges aren't used to waiting, huh?
Thank you, Supervisor. One thing that I'll say that obviously, and it's just making a statement that we need to find the sweet spot, and the one thing that I will definitely advocate for, and I understand as we talk about the leap to some sort of custodial locked facility or what have you, and we need to find the answers to that. But we also have to remember that it's not simply being under the influence by itself. There are communities, there's businesses, there's neighborhoods that are impacted by the negative ramifications that come from that, and they're a stakeholder in this as well. And so that's that balance that we need to strike. That as we come up with solutions, there's communities that are being victimized by the ramifications of this as well.
Thank you. Maya? And then
Wow,
Judge
I didn't
Manley.
even pay him to say that. Representing many of those neighborhoods. What I was actually going to bring up on the Tuesday meeting is if someone from the PD can be there again to address that direct referral. I have an example of someone who is terrorizing a whole neighborhood and trying to get that the police are very aware of this individual. He's attacked people physically. He is not, I'm not a mental health professional, but he's not there, right? And so my issue is, how do we get that person into that? Is it a detox bed? Is it another type of bed? I don't know. And I can't even delve into like dual diagnosis because I know that it can get complex. But from the neighborhood perspective, I need that individual to get into a bed, whether it's locked or unlocked, or whether it's a detox or something else. I don't have the answer to that, but making that connection from the street to a bed is really critical for us as a community. Thank you.
Tony, when you make your report, are you going to give a proposal as to the number of detox beds we need in this county?
I don't know that I'll have that number. I know what we have, and I know what we're asking for. from
Okay,
the
I know we have, I mean, everyone's touched on this, but this is a serious problem in the courts. I see it every day. People who want detox, willing to do it, and they can't possibly get in it.
Well,
And they're left on the streets.
I will bring as much data and information as I can on Tuesday, and if we needed it, there is likely going to be additional follow-up on this as well. Okay, that's what I can commit to.
Thank you.
We understand the issue.
I'm going to take one more comment, and then I want to tell you I've been a very bad chair. And this meeting goes for 2 hours, and we just took 1 hour on our first issue, or 40 minutes, 50 minutes. But it was really good. It was worth the conversation. So Maya, I'm going to ask you to work with our presenters because we're going to have to make some decisions about today. Oh, you're saying look at the phone. You already did that? All right, I will. Molly, go ahead.
Thank you. Just one other quick question related to step-down facilities. So I think one of your slides that's not in the packet, but that you projected showed someone who had been in a locked facility on an LPS conservatorship released to a homeless shelter. And I'm curious about that. So I'm curious about that particular case, but also in general, what step-down facilities are available when someone comes off a conservatorship, but obviously still has issues.
I don't know the specific details of that case, but the person was no longer gravely disabled and had nowhere else to go, so was sent to a homeless shelter. But I do believe there are supportive services in place when that happens. The majority of the step-downs are board and care, residential care facilities.
But I think the issue, and I'll just chime in here, I think the reality is that when we can't track what happened to somebody, that's a challenge with our system. And I'm not saying you don't have the information in front of you, but one of the points I'm going to make is that we can't make the case for what our needs are if we say, because in a way I feel like we've had a little bit of a flat earth. I don't just mean us. I mean the world has had a flat earth kind of response to this, meaning that when someone's off our part of the planet, they're gone. And then we see them again when they climb back up. And I think we have to, we can't address it that way anymore. And I think it's okay to say, this is the need, and we're going to fund this much of it because that's where we can afford to start, and this is what our aspirations are going to be. Because I think that's the way to build more trust with our partners, is to just be frank about what we have and what we don't have, when we have it and when we don't have it. So I think that's just, I think it will keep us from pointing fingers at each other. Thank you. Maya, what I'm going to ask you to do, I saw your note, but what I need to know is that we have 5 other presenters and what folks' availability is for our next meeting, so we can make some decisions about that. I didn't see that on my phone. So I believe that 8 and 9 should be bumped. Should not be bumped or should be bumped? Should not. Okay, so if you don't mind, just to my colleagues here and even to the presenters, if we can move to item 8 and then item 9, and Gary and Dr. Miller and Nathaniel, I'm sorry to bump you, but we'll go back in that order if that's okay. And in fact, as to not make you wait, particularly Dr. Miller, I think we've already done this to you once. You're first on the agenda next time, and I apologize for that. And and Gary, you have to be here anyway, right? Okay. So Dr. Miller, you're the only one that can be somewhere else. These 2 have to stay with me. So we'll let you free for the next meeting, and then we'll get to them as quickly as we can. So we're going to move to item 8, if that's all right with my colleagues. And this is to receive a report from the Department of Rehabilitation, VMC, relating to their work with patients with traumatic brain injury. And we're going to hear item 8 concurrently, and this is to receive a report from the San Andreas Regional Center relating to the individuals with traumatic brain injuries and services offered by SARC. And you may recall that there was some discussion with us about when can someone still get services, how old do you have to be, when do you get screened, and all that. So part of this was to help us be more informed as we have this discussion. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves, let me say thank you all for joining us. And whoever's going to start it. I
Good
don't know.
afternoon. I'm Sonia Menzies. I'm the Director for Ambulatory and Community Health Services at Valley Medical Centre. I'm going to be sitting by to assist if there are any questions.
Great. And I just want to have everybody introduce themselves first, and then we'll go into the presentation.
Great, thank you. So, Dr. Henry Hoy, thank you, committee, for the invitation to speak about traumatic brain injury. A little bit about myself.
Can you hold on one moment?
Yeah.
And then would you just introduce yourself so everybody knows who's here? Can you turn your mic on and try that again? There's a button right below it. Thank you. I don't know,
How's that?
Better, yay.
Sorry. It's Dr. Carrie Mojo, San Andreas Regional Center Clinical Manager.
Javier Zaldivar, San Andreas Regional Center Executive Director.
Welcome. Thank you. Doctor?
Sure. So a little bit about myself. I am board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation and brain injury medicine. I'm chief of brain injury rehabilitation at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, and I sit on the Traumatic Brain Injury Advisory Board for the state of California, and that is through the Department of Rehabilitation. So when it comes to traumatic brain injury, I could talk about this for hours, but obviously in the interest of time, I do have a set of slides that will give you an overview and about traumatic brain injury and some of the services available through SCVMC. So I'll start off with the definition. Traumatic brain injury, I'm going to abbreviate that to TBI moving forward, refers to damage to the brain that's caused by some external force. That could be acceleration, deceleration forces happening upon somebody's body, skull, and brain in a car accident. It could be from direct trauma, from something like a gunshot wound to the head. It could be from blunt trauma, from somebody falling down, shaking your brain inside the skull and leading to cerebral contusions. So this is something that's happening from an outside force to the body. A TBI is not something that's originates internally. So it's not a stroke, it's not a tumor within the brain. It would not be an anoxic brain injury that can sometimes happen when there is a lack of oxygen going to the brain. This is data from the CDC from 2013, looking at some of your leading causes of traumatic brain injury. Obviously, falls is going to be, number one there. That tends to impact your very young population, so those under the age of 4, as well as those who are over the age of 65. Motor vehicle accidents, different kinds of trauma or assaults, kind of round out some of those other higher percentages in terms of leading causes of traumatic brain injury. What are some of the risk factors that, put someone at risk for having an injury like this? So as I mentioned, children, those who are under the age of 4, obviously they're going to get themselves into trouble and sometimes can fall and hit their head. You can see TBIs occur more commonly in the young adult population, especially those between the ages of 15 and 24. I think, that population may be more susceptible for risk-taking. And then as we get into the older population, falls becomes, again, higher risk. So definitely want to be safe with ladders. You can see here, males in any age group is a risk factor in itself. For traumatic brain injury, it's almost close to a 3-to-1 ratio that TBI is going to be more common in males than females. I think an important point to note as well is that almost half of TBIs involve alcohol use, whether that is for the victim or the person causing that injury. And so what is the impact of a traumatic brain injury? Each TBI in itself is going to be very unique. Depending upon, which part of the brain has been affected, that's going to result in somebody's symptoms and deficits following that injury. The brain is going to result in, injury to the brain is going to result in some changes in your cognitions, whether that's your ability to focus, affecting your memory, ability to concentrate, multitask. Emotionally, it can dysregulate someone's mood, lead to agitation, irritability. Certain parts of the brain are obviously going to control your strength, your function in terms of controlling your limbs. And then, your sensory aspects. So each injury is going to be unique in that treatment and rehabilitation is going to be very individualized depending upon the severity. Like any illness, there is a spectrum of severity for traumatic brain injury within the mild category. And this severity is kind of determined by somebody's level of arousal, alertness, and their ability to follow commands early on. For mild traumatic brain injury, that kind of bigger umbrella within that will fall something like concussions. That's been highly publicized over the past several years in terms of sports concussions. And so something like that is going to fall in your mild category. For patients with a mild traumatic brain injury, typically majority of those will have, on traditional imaging, CAT scan and MRI, they will not have any structural findings. There won't be evidence of large hemorrhages or bleeding. Unlike your more moderate to severe traumatic brain injury, in that situation, this is going to involve, higher impacts, a more severe accident resulting in typically areas of bleeding within the brain that are going to result in more severe disability. In terms of just kind of general flow of what happens to a patient when they sustain a TBI, for those who have mild TBIs, sometimes patients don't get any care. I think there's been a big push over the past several years on raising awareness about concussions, especially in sports. There's a lot of different pushes in legislations, especially for these, youth athletes in terms of outlining what return to play and management should be. But, there's going to be some that sustain a mild TBI and don't get any care. Others may present to their primary care provider and urgent care. Others may present to the emergency department, and depending upon their symptoms and their imaging and, how they're recovering initially, those patients, will likely be discharged home. For mild traumatic brain injuries, majority of those patients are going to recover just with time and, some symptom management. So for the outpatient care for someone who's had a concussion or mild TBI, that's going to consist of, education, maybe a specialty consultation with somebody who's specialized in traumatic brain injury or concussion management. There can be different medications used for treatment and symptom management. Many times patients will have headaches or dizziness. You can incorporate different therapies for treatments, whether that's physical therapy, speech therapy, vestibular therapy. So that's kind of the outline for someone who's had a mild traumatic brain injury. When you look at more moderate and severe TBIs, that's going to be different. So these are more significant injuries. You have, EMS 911 being called. These are more emergent situations. Some of these patients aren't going to survive. Others are going to be taken to an emergency department. From there, you likely be admitted into the hospital for further intervention and management. As these patients are recovering within the hospital, different pathways that they can take from that point are, some may be discharged to home, and I think there's different factors that may affect whether or not somebody will go home initially. It's what level of disability do they have? Have they recovered very quickly? How much assistance from a physical standpoint or supervision standpoint does someone need? So the level of their disability at that moment in time, I think, is going to play a factor. What's their support system? Do they have friends, family that can provide care? What kind of resources do they have? For your more moderate to severe brain injuries, other options, depending on if they meet certain criteria, could be acute inpatient rehabilitation. That's where somebody is hospitalized for the rehab after TBI, and this is the most intensive way somebody can rehabilitate after this kind of injury. Sometimes patients aren't ready for that level of rehab, and so they may discharge to a skilled nursing facility or possibly a long-term acute care facility, depending upon their medical complexity, medical acuity, and what point they are in their recovery. And then after that, after rehab or some of those other scenarios, patients, the goal is to get them back to home. But there's certain situations where that becomes more challenging, and there are definitely gaps, I think, in the care. Other options after the hospital and some of these clinical settings that I mentioned could be post-acute transitional rehab. But those settings are few and far between. There's only a few of those options here in Northern California. Post-acute rehab is intensive rehab in more of a home-like setting with focus on community reintegration. It's a step before somebody goes back to home. And then for patients who maybe don't have the support at home, do they have other options for long-term care, like group homes, residential care, congregate facilities? So do some of these patients stay kind of within the skilled nursing facility system or the hospital system because they don't have anywhere to go? Transitioning to Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, we are a level 1 trauma center for adults and level 2 for pediatrics. So we will see, a significant amount of trauma patients who present with traumatic brain injury. Obviously, I'm representing our rehabilitation center. In terms of services for those who have traumatic brain injury, clinically, we have specialists in neurology, neurosurgery. I am part of the physical medicine and rehabilitation department. Psychology, psychiatry services, therapy services, including physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, recreational therapy. For the Brain Injury Rehab Center, I think we have some highly skilled and experienced staff who are subspecialized in the area of treating patients who have traumatic brain injury. So we probably admit to our rehab center patients who are more medically complex or more agitated than other rehab centers may take on initially. The clinical settings where we'll see patients with TBI or in the acute hospital, and then some of those patients may transition to the acute inpatient rehab center, and then following that, they will follow up in our outpatient rehabilitation center, seeing a brain injury specialist from a physician standpoint, likely continuing the rehab in an outpatient setting. But we also have, patients who, come from all over the region. I think we have, a good reputation in terms of our traumatic brain injury rehab care. So some patients will follow up at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center for the ongoing therapies, but others may, go someplace that's more local to where they reside. In terms of some of the barriers to care and services, I think insurance coverage does play a factor in what options someone has after a traumatic brain injury. There's certain programs that aren't covered by certain insurances. The post-acute transitional rehabs, that step of going to a rehab center that's focused kind of on community reintegration and home, that's not something that's typically covered by most insurances. Only certain ones will, authorize that level of rehab. I think somebody may have mentioned, a behavioral health waiver. For TBI, there's no waiver for Medi-Cal in California. I'm pretty sure other states do have a TBI waiver that may make Medicaid resources more available for these patients for their kind of long-term care. Someone's personal finances and resources, what's their support system? If somebody doesn't have family or friends that can provide care, that does make it more challenging for someone to reintegrate into the community. What level of disability does this TBI patient, end up with long-term plays a factor. Those who have more mild symptoms and have a quicker recovery and who are younger, I think have, more potential to improve. And then, associated with traumatic brain injury, oftentimes patients can have behavioral health needs as well. With dysregulation of someone's mood and increased irritability, some of these patients may become walking wounded, where physically they're very mobile and you might not notice any deficits, but cognitively they can be irritable, easily get agitated, and oftentimes those are some of the most challenging patients. And then, like I mentioned before, substance use, alcohol use, there's definitely an overlap in terms of that and TBI as well. What kind of community services are available for these patients? One program I wanted to highlight is Services for Brain Injury. That is here in downtown San Jose. It is one of 7 state-funded TBI sites. It's the only site for Santa Clara County, and there are many counties in California that do not have that available. That's a program that offers, vocational rehab, outpatient therapies, and support groups, other services that are designated for patients who've had these kind of injuries. That's a nonprofit organization. There are different support groups out in the community. We have different support groups available at Valley Medical Center for those who have TBI. I think, the California Department of Rehabilitation can be a resource, or vocational rehabilitation. There are different nonprofit organizations out there that can provide education support, directory for resources. Maybe there are day treatment programs that a patient can attend to, continue their therapy and recovery during the day. And I just wanted to transition a little bit to talk about things from a state-wide level. Like I mentioned, there are 7 state-funded TBI sites in California. This was a program enacted in 1988 with the California TBI program to fund local community-based services for those who sustained these kind of injuries. That started off with $150,000 per site, and it's continued at that level. And, from my personal opinion, I think $150,000 in 1988 is very different from 2019. In 2018, that funding was actually reduced to $115,000, but was recently restored to the historical amount. But $150,000 for these individual sites, and they're kind of located on the right. Services for brain injuries, what we have in Santa Clara County. It's probably challenging for them to do exactly what they want to do to help those in the community with that level of funding, and so they have to get, I think, money from different resources. And I mentioned that I am on the California Traumatic Brain Injury Advisory Board. That was part of the Reauthorization Act of 2014, and part of what we have been working on over the past year. We first started meeting earlier in 2019. Our goals are to develop an annual TBI state plan, plan for developing a TBI state registry, and to also conduct a comprehensive review and analysis of services, supports, and other assistance available to those with TBI. So really trying to do a needs assessment for this community. Management in rehab and reintegration for these patients is, obviously a challenge for our county, but, also from a statewide level. And that kind of wraps up my slides, and I guess I'll open to questions.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask if the representatives from SARC can present now. And just as a background, just as a reminder for everybody, the reason we were doing these together was that Judge Manley and others raised the issue of the number of folks with TBI who are coming in both in mental health and to the courts and even to the jails without it being its own discrete. Is it a mental health issue? Is it a medical issue? I mean, there have been some challenges. And then when do people get services? And then there was some confusion about what SARC does relative to that. So if we could have you do your presentation, and then I'll open it up for comments or questions. Thank you. And welcome again.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Javier Zaldivar, the Executive Director at San Andreas Regional Center, and hopefully we'll answer all of your questions today related to TBI. And before Dr. Carrie Amoljo does her presentation, just a couple of things to remember is that in the end, services that are offered through the regional center are still voluntary. There's often the misconception that because you are affiliated with the regional center, that we must provide services. And to a degree, we are there to provide, but ultimately it is the choice of the individual, whether they use it or not. We don't have the authority or to compel anybody to take a service. The second thing to remember as Dr. Carey does her presentation, and she will hit on it, is that right now under California law, the eligibility for regional center, the traumatic insult must have occurred before the age of 18. There was a state push, and it's still in the back burner for a couple of assembly people to change the eligibility criteria for TBI to 25. But right now, the actual age is 18. If we have somebody that is typically developing and they had an accident at 17.9 and we were able to determine that it was going to be lifelong, the injury, they would be eligible. that very same accident, let's say, one of the kids we did bring in was a kid that was skateboarding, had a really serious accident, and he was actually 17.5 when the accident happened. They contacted us a little bit, almost a year later, and the disabilities he was showing were going to be lifelong. We were able to bring him in under for regional center services, but had that accident happen at age 18, we would not have been able to help him. Oops, my phone turned off. So that is another thing to remember. The third thing is that simply having a traumatic brain injury is not enough for eligibility. And Dr. Carey will go through, it is the injury and then the substantial disability. And there are 7 criteria that we will talk about in just a couple of seconds. And then finally, oftentimes we do get the calls from the hospital that somebody has had either a serious accident or something that they suspect is going to lead to a lifelong issue, and they do have a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. However, we often do advise, and we probably will wait at least a year before we decide to do an assessment. Many people that have the traumatic insult, for whatever caused it, and as they're getting their therapies that the doctor mentioned earlier, we will see improvement. They may not come back to their previous state of functioning, but they do come back to some form of functioning. So what we try to do is to be very cautious in calling somebody lifelong disabled is what we are doing when somebody is made regional center eligible. And we have to make sure that before we do that we actually have given them the opportunity to benefit from therapies. So with that said, hopefully keep all of that in the back of your mind as Dr. Carey Mojo, our Director for Clinical Programming, Autism Specialist, does a presentation on regional center eligibility. And then when she gets to the services, I'll jump in also.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here today. I think it's a good opportunity to share what regional center services can and cannot do. And I think the more we understand that, the more we'll be able to appropriately connect the individuals that need supports, regardless of what their circumstances are. So San Andreas serves 17,000 consumers over 4 counties: Santa Clara, San Benito, Santa Cruz, and Monterey. We just did a data run yesterday in preparation for this presentation, and we have a total of 3 clients in our system out of those 17,000 who are made eligible for regional center services under a developmental disability that was due to a traumatic brain injury. Only 3. I was actually a little surprised by that number. I thought it might have been a dozen, but it's only 3. And after I go through the eligibility criteria and how we make these decisions about who is eligible for services, I think that'll make more sense why that's such a small number. We do have we have many, many more people in our system who are eligible due to other types of head injury, closed head injuries. Probably most common is anoxic brain damage unfortunately, from near drowning in children, strokes, seizures resulting in anoxic brain damage, which could cause a developmental disability. That is by far a more common population in the regional center clientele. So the regional center services are unique to California, and it is all governed by the Lanterman Act, which is an entitlement program under Welfare and Institution Codes 4512. The Lanterman Act defines what a developmental disability what it is, and it also defines how regional centers will serve the individuals who come into our system. So just the overview is that Lanterman says that a developmental disability must originate before age 18. It must continue or be expected to continue indefinitely, and it constitutes a substantial disability to that individual and affects at least 3 of 7 major life domains. There are only 5 eligible conditions for regional center services, no matter what county or what part of the state that you're in. These rules are applied consistently across the state, and those conditions are intellectual disability, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, autism, and a fifth condition that is sometimes referred to as the other condition, which is defined as a developmental disability that requires services that are similar to those required by people with intellectual disabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Lanterman Act also describes who should not be eligible for regional center services. And for instance, someone who might have serious disabilities as a child as a result of psychiatric issues or physical issues are not eligible for regional center services. And I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So those are the 5 conditions. The individuals who do come into our system due to a traumatic brain injury are often found eligible because they have a resulting epilepsy, which is poorly controlled, or they have a condition similar to an intellectual disability. So it's important to keep in mind that a traumatic brain injury in itself is not considered a developmental disability under the Lanterman Act. Some other conditions have to be met. So if someone, let's say a 16-year-old has a traumatic brain injury and they are coming in for an assessment and intake, what we first need to determine is that the injury did occur before age 18. That's the easy part. We then have to establish that the injury resulted in lifelong impairments in 3 or more major life domains. And the domains that we look at in terms of major life impairments, there are only 7, and these are tied to the federal definition of substantial disability. The first life domain is receptive and expressive language. The second is self-care. The third is learning, mobility, self-direction, which can be defined as the ability to regulate your behavior, emotional regulation, behavioral regulation. Also the capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Regional centers serve people from birth to death, so we are often looking at individuals across the lifespan. So depending on the age of the applicant who is applying for eligibility, we will not necessarily look at the last 2 areas. And we're not going to consider whether a child has the capacity for independent living or economic self-sufficiency. So all these domains are assessed based on both the age and sociocultural issues for the individual. So the 5th condition, also known as the other condition, is it was established because there are individuals that need services that were designed for people with intellectual disabilities, but for whatever reason they have not been diagnosed with an intellectual disability. The most common reason that might happen is if someone had a period of typical development and then they had some insult to the brain. And that could be a stroke, it could be a traumatic brain injury, it could be encephalitis. If they've had a period of normal development, it's not really fair to use the term intellectual disability to someone who was typically developing until they had a head injury or a stroke at age 16. So the 5th condition is a condition that we would potentially consider someone for eligibility under if they did have a traumatic brain injury. We would also look at seizures, epilepsy, and we would look at intellectual disability. Although a lot of individuals who sustain traumatic brain injuries do develop seizures as a result, having epilepsy or a seizure disorder in itself can't be considered a developmental disability unless it was before age 18. And unless the seizures are not well controlled. So if someone does have epilepsy as a result of a TBI, if the medication is controlling the seizures to the point where they can engage in daily activities without substantial disability, then that person would not be found eligible for regional center services.
And I might add, this is why the big push to change the eligibility to age 25, as the doctor mentioned earlier. You will see that traumatic brain injuries often occur in young males after the age of 18, before the age of 22, 23, 24, and it is often when young males are the most reckless. And unfortunately, as I mentioned right now, our services can only be considered if that traumatic insult occurred before the age of 18. It may change one day, but right now, that is the #1 thing we look at.
So once someone is found eligible for regional center services, they retain those services for life, and we develop an individualized program plan for that person, which is going to be either specialized services that can only be obtained through regional center, or sometimes they are services that are specialized because we've taken generic resources and adapted them specifically for a person. The majority of our services fall under the categories of case management, independent living supports, supported living services, that's what ILS, SOS is, residential care, and supported employment. We do have a lot of folks in our system who are judicially involved, and for those we also provide diversion programs if that's ordered by the court. We do court-ordered competency evaluations, and we also provide competency training if the person is not found competent. Something to keep in mind about regional center services is that we cannot provide a service that is generically available under public funding, and that includes things like behavioral health treatment, education, medical care, cognitive rehabilitation if you have that through your insurance. So there are limitations in terms of the services that we provide, and we don't have any services that are specifically for individuals who have a traumatic brain injury. Although for folks that might have that condition in our system, we can develop some sort of specialized supports that will allow them to integrate into the community at the highest level that they can.
And I might add also that services that we offer, the regional center system is the payer of last resort. Oftentimes a traumatic brain injury is medical in nature, and before we will approve a service, we will go through the process of determining whether or not there is private insurance, and if there isn't private insurance, will the person qualify for Medi-Cal, and if they do qualify for Medi-Cal, what services may be available for that person. So as the payer of last resort, we're obligated to go through that process also.
And I don't want to minimize the role of the case management that we provide, because for a family or a client to navigate the network of services that they might have access to, whether that be managed Medi-Cal, whether that be things like SSI, specialized educational programs, our service coordinators can help the family and the individual to find those services and make sure that they're meeting those needs.
And I think that's our presentation.
Okay, sorry. There was no drum roll or anything there.
It wasn't that exciting.
No, it wasn't that. It was actually very important. So the reason we wanted to hear these together is that we had had a discussion here about how we address so many people that at least Judge Manley is finding in his court that have a traumatic brain injury. And so maybe I'll just go ahead and let you start. Do you have comments or questions? And then if there is anybody else.
The reason I raise this, and I really would like to, and I must first say that I have a special calendar court just for San Andreas clients, and the services they provide are incredible, and the support and the number of case managers and for almost everything is unbelievable. But and it really does lead to real progress and success in the diversion and other programs that we have. But what I wanted to talk more about, what I'm really interested in, is Valley Medical. You see, first of all, we are seeing more and more people coming into the criminal justice system, charged with a crime, and they have suffered TBI, all right? And on your barriers to care and services, the people I see meet every one of these. They have no insurance. We don't have the federal waiver. They don't have any money. They're indigent, homeless, in jail. They have behavioral health needs, and they have substance abuse needs, and agitation or whatever else you could add here will be there. Now, here's the issue to me. When someone comes in with a behavioral health problem, the county, through behavioral health and Tony's wonderful organization, provides assessment, referral, treatment. We have wonderful treatment providers. They go to the providers. However, the minute the initials TBI or traumatic brain injury, that's the end of it. This is not behavioral health, Judge. This is medical. I mean, it's just like dementia. I mean, this is not in our area. So the frustration we have in the courts is we need to refer these people. The way behavioral health works is they reach out and they help us in every way. They'll even now going into the jail. I will get requests from the jail. This person needs testing. He needs, this is a TBI that we have we got the backup documentation, the diagnosis, everything. The person's totally indigent, homeless, sitting in a jail cell. Now, how can we move him? I mean, how can we bring your system in with behavioral health to help us move these offenders into treatment instead of keeping them in jail again and again and again because the same behavior is repeated? See, that's what I'm really interested in finding out. Is it to go, I know you listed this nonprofit organization. Should they all be sent there? Do you have a referral service? Is there, I will tell you what happens is the defendants will say, or I will be told, well, all right, you have to have a referral from your primary care physician. They don't have a primary care physician. You want to get one, you wait 60 days, 90 days, whatever. And I'm dealing with people who are in jail right now. We have to come up with some sort of plan. And since you have no plan, you don't keep people in jail just because you can't help them. You let them out of jail and you hope, you give them the best advice you can, then they come right back. So is there a way to set up a system where we could have these individuals referred directly to someone where something would happen?
There's a lot to unravel with that. So I wish there was an easy answer. Obviously, there's not. I would say it takes a team to help somebody recover and rehabilitate after traumatic brain injury. Now, again, there's a lot of overlap with behavioral health needs and traumatic brain injury. Oftentimes, those symptoms are hard to tease out as to which is the driving force for, why somebody is maybe in a downward spiral. As the representatives from SARC mentioned, I think having a case manager can be, very helpful for these individuals who, if they're recovering from a TBI, they may be already set up with resources but don't remember to go or can't follow through or, having someone else kind of guide them and navigate them through the pathway can be very important. From representing our medical staff in the rehab department at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, we do see patients who have TBIs as outpatients. We don't have a specific clinic, but many of the patients who come to our neuro rehab clinic, are recovering from TBI. Part of what we would do is manage their symptoms if we can medically, pharmacologically, as well as refer them to I think therapies that are needed to help with that recovery. I think one point to highlight is, making sure that somebody is referred for vocational rehab is, I think key. Someone's ability to reintegrate into community, being able to find a job or, find what kind of jobs are appropriate for someone after sustaining a TBI. I think can be very helpful in that keeping somebody out of that, a cycle that you described. But there's not one piece to it. I think this is something that would have to be addressed from many different angles.
No, I understand that. But let me say, what I'm suggesting is that we try to find a way to bring you together with behavioral health. And let me give you an example. I have a large veterans treatment court, and I see many, many veterans. I have all these young men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria. They all have TBI, and they also have behavioral health issues. They also all, use drugs, alcohol, all of that. The VA has a wonderful system of addressing each one of those because it's all centralized. In other words, if you send someone to let's say substance abuse at the VA, and they also have cognitive TBI issues, they will directly refer them to the TBI. And what I see here is that I have somebody who has substance abuse issues and mental illness, but there's no way that I know of, unless Tony does, of how an assessor, someone who's assessing, or a case manager, or anyone would get someone into your system. You see, it's not, in the Veterans Administration, that's the way it works. I mean, there's no choice here. And I was just wondering if you've studied the way they do things, and that so perhaps we could replicate them in our county.
That's hard for me to speak on. That's a very different system with, that removes, I think, the insurance component of care and.
I understand that, but see, here's what frustrates me is that it would seem to me that you would be meeting with Tony all the time to figure this out. What I'm trying to do is encourage you to become a part of all of our, the whole person care concept is what I'm getting to. And I just feel that it's being blocked, but I've talked too much, and that's it.
Can I just make an observation? Did you want to respond?
I just wanted to respond just to
and then we'll go to
give
Tony and then
an
Aaron.
outline. I do agree. I think and really appreciate that that your group brought this question forward, because it actually started us talking around some of those connections. And I would think, and it's really on me as well, to connect with Tony around what we could be doing better and looking for those other best practices that are out there. I don't think we've probably done enough to look at that, and I think that I'm very open, and I know I would love to work with Tony to look at some of those other possibilities. Some of the things I think that really connect, that I was hearing from the entire group as well, is that sort of what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing, because we do know that many of these head injuries, when we discussed it, come from the substance abuse issues, which I think related very much to that medical substance abuse treatment situation. How do we prevent it in the first place so that we don't get as many of those injuries? How do we expand the work also and support this team when we're seeing that at 18, when you've got a cut-off point at 18, when you know a bulk of these injuries occur in that 18 to 25 year time frame? There's an absolute disconnect, and we did see that as this group brought it forward, and we looked to see where our gaps were. We felt that as well there are certainly gaps. We are dealing primarily at VMC with the physical components of really what's going on after the injury occurs. But when a patient has very few resources out there, again, I think it's the connection with Key and others as well, when they have very few resources out there, where they have family that can't support them, when they have no stable housing after a head injury, there's not a lot that we've really discovered that's out there. So those folks fall through the gaps, and they would be the ones you would be seeing who have very little control of sometimes emotional issues, agitation, those other things that end up in the law enforcement arena. So we definitely have a ways to go.
So Tony, and then Aaron, and then David.
Actually, two of us. That's okay. We'll figure it out.
I'm Tony's personal secretary.
You are. You're doing a very good job, Molly. I want to make a couple of comments, because there are many issues that we've talked about today that are big state policy issues. And one of the ones that keeps coming up, whether you're a physician or whether you're a regional center or whether you're a behavioral health department or whether you're working with people in custody, is that we have individuals with TBI who have nowhere to go, and the funding for all of you has been cut dramatically, which we're aware of. You have very tight regulations, and we push, and I know my team pushes, and they don't meet the 18 and all of that. I appreciate the partnership, but your funding has been cut. You see the state funding as a physician leader that has been cut, and I think part of this issue is that it is expensive to provide ongoing housing and support services, which quite candidly, as a former rehab nurse, can be for life. And so we can talk about what's possible in our county, but I think this, along with some of the other things we're going to talk about on Tuesday, this is a policy issue, Judge Manley, at the state level, and it's a policy issue that impacts people across California. This is not a Santa Clara issue. This is an issue in many parts of the state, is a hot issue. So I'm just going to say, I think that some of the work we're talking about, I'm going to push that we are more active on the legislative piece, because many of the counties are talking about this issue, residential care facilities. We've got a whole list of them, but this is a hot one.
Thank you. Aaron? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're going to tag team. I just wanted to comment. It's not really a city of San Jose so much as I worked with veterans for 17 years, and really appreciate your comments, Judge, in bringing this up. The VA wasn't always so centralized, and in fact, many private groups like the Navy SEAL Foundation fund those chambers, right, specifically for TBI, because it's such an issue, and the VA did make great strides. I'm hopeful that California will too, but also wanted to point out something that that I learned through my work with veterans was that there have been some studies that have shown that a lot of what has been attributed to PTSD is in fact TBI. So I just wanted to point that out, and also point out that the Services for Brain Injury does an amazing job. They're really an incredible organization. So thank you for bringing this to light today.
Just wanted to, when I did a quick Google search, which is always so dangerous, the numbers I saw was that prevalence rate for TBI in the general population is 8.5%, and in the prison population it's 60%. So I mean, I don't think there's any way that we can say, here's your TBI folks, you know, go deal with them. And it seems to me that a whole lot of the folks that we're dealing with are going to be dually or triply diagnosed with mental health, substance abuse, and TBI. So it seems that part of what would be really useful is for those of us on the behavioral health side, it's like, okay, how do we identify it and what do we do about it? Because if we're figuring 60% of our clients have it in our criminal justice populations, that's good to know. But I don't think it's, from the sound of it, there is not a system to say, here's where the TBI folks go.
David?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, it seems we have substantive problems, which are like, how do we actually treat people, and do we have enough resources, housing in particular? But it does seem like that what's been illuminated is a process problem, and I'm wondering if we can address that. And the process one is that Judge Manley highlighted, which you know happens over and over again, but with different pieces of it. So when we started this, whatever it is, 20 years ago, it was that, you know, we'd be in court and we'd have someone from drug and alcohol, but we wouldn't have mental health, or we'd have mental health and we wouldn't have drug and alcohol. And then there's things we do well, you know, the lawyers and the judges, but what we're trying to do is less of the stuff we don't do well. And what we don't do well is actually provide the diagnosis and the treatment plan. But we get stuck doing it if there's no one else, you know, if there's people missing. And so the analogy I think of sometimes is like, if there's a client with a criminal problem, they don't go to my friends at the public defender office and have them say, oh no, that's a search and seizure problem, you got to go somewhere else, I only do constitutional issues, or I only do investigative issues. Like, you kind of have to at least figure out what it is. So it sounds to me we just need either literally at the table with us in the court, or there's a process whereby when we send off and say, okay, here we have this person, we'd like to get a plan for them, that we don't end up with a report back saying, oh, the plan was somebody who wasn't at the table really should probably look at this person. So I'm wondering whether I mean, this would be something we'd have to create, but whether the county would be willing, and whether you'd be willing to direct it so that there is a process whereby when we send someone for evaluation, we just have everyone evaluating who needs to evaluate them, and then we can figure out what the plan is. And I know there'll be problems, like we don't have housing or we don't have enough, but I think this is illustrated that we need to fix that process problem where it sounds like you folks are missing from our process.
One request I would like to make, and I was actually having this conversation with Miguel, is to see if we can't get Miguel and Renee Santiago, who's the what is his title? He's a county exec, but is he like king or? So he's a director of health and hospital. I think he's a king of it. But what I think may be of value is for Miguel, since he was here, to update Renee and then to get everybody in a room and have a conversation about this. Because I think you're right. I think there's a question about the diagnostics of it. I also think that there's just a very practical set of questions about how we're identifying and then addressing it irrespective of what the state's doing. And I think I just want to lift up the point that, Tony, that you raised, is that we got to fight on that front. But part of the most effective way we fight on those fronts is when we start doing the work ourselves. We find out how much it costs, we find out what the need is, and then we can be very explicit with them about what our needs are. So I would just like to recommend that under the leadership of Miguel, that we work with Renee. And then I think, David, I think there's a number of people here at the table that ought to sit at least in those first discussions with, and Judge Manley, we're volunteering you if Deborah says it's okay, if the presiding judge says it's okay. But anyway, to get people in a room and have a deeper conversation. And I also think that it would be good to have the regional center there too. And let me just say why I think the point that's raised about how we have a significant discussion about how we get to the age of 25 is really critical. But I also think better understanding what the implications of those injuries are. And one other thing I think we just cannot know, I think we know so little about the human brain still that we're going to keep learning more and more and more, because I think some of the diagnostic challenges we have is that often folks who have one thing don't, we love to say dual diagnosis, but when I was hearing Aaron say, triple diagnosis, it got me thinking about the work that Miguel led on fetal alcohol syndrome. That is something that's very difficult to diagnose, but we know it exists. And, so it just got me thinking that there's a lot more work to be done. But that being said, I think very focused on how we get services through, irrespective of what they come through, I think is really critical. So I'm going to request that if you think you need to be at that table, you send Maya a note. Maya will pull that together, package it up to get to Renee and Miguel, along with the two presentations that we had, along with the timestamp of the discussion. So Renee will have a chance to watch it, even though he wasn't here as he was being volunteered, so that he can benefit from this discussion. Other thoughts about that? And then I saw you, go ahead, what were you going to say? No, please. No, it's okay, I'll work to it. Okay. Anybody else have a comment on this area? No, I do want to just say thank you. How I think this was two very thoughtful discussions from all of you today. I love having you all together. We get some great ideas and observations. We'll ask that we get some feedback on this. We're at the next meeting. What we deferred today was we deferred to our next meeting, or continued to our next meeting. I'm not sure the right way to say that, David, but was item 7 and item 6, and item 6 was Dr. Miller's presentation, which will go first. Item 7 was Gary's, which will go second. And then, and 5, I skipped 5 too. Lord, what was I doing there? Oh yeah, that's right. And 5, Dr. Woods. So sorry I did that. So you are 1, 2, and 3, our next meeting. Our next meeting is going to be February 19th at 2:30. And if you are interested in doing some work between now and then, like all of you have free time, let Maya know. For some of you, it will be less optional, I'm sure, when Renee calls you. But I want to say thank you. And there are any closing comments? I will make one announcement. Yeah, and that is that the item that we were discussing earlier will be heard at approximately 11 o'clock on Tuesday, and that's the response to the referral from Supervisor Cortesia and I on a whole list of issues that we wanted to address relative to engagement and making sure we're serving the hardest to need, the highest need, hardest to serve folks. And that will be at 11 o'clock. So be there or be square. Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays. Thank you. There's on Thanksgiving here.